2 disclaimers before I dive into this story. Number 1, I'm not a writer. I do not claim to be a writer, and I have not written anything more extensive than an email since school. Number 2, this actually happened, and it is being relayed exactly as I remember it. I grew up in a suburb of Sydney, New South Wales. I spent my entire childhood there and simply could not have asked for a better place to live as a kid. The town was closely knit, clean and safe. Growing up, I could have cared less about these facts. But, in hindsight, it allowed me to have a great deal of independence at a young age due to my parents' peace of mind. As such, I did what any young Aussie male would do with his life, and I spent most of my time pulling relatively harmless pranks. Me and my mates, we would pull ridiculous stunts, which, in all likelihood, only we found amusing. We terrorized the neighborhood a bit, but it was all rather harmless, benign fun. Moreover, living in a relatively sheltered community, my friends and I, we all thrived on pushing the envelope. We loved anything that felt remotely dangerous or scary, simply as a rebellion from the underlying truth that where we lived was a good and safe place. These extracurricular activities ranged from sneaking out at night to jumping the 40-foot trestles into the river. We had some close calls. Someone would get a little banged up on the jump, or the local cops would chase us for being out after curfew. But nothing ever really made us think twice or caused us to reassess what we were doing with our lives. We were kids. We felt impervious to serious damage, and nothing out there in our daily lives ever really scared us. The events of a single night caused all of that to change. This began with a fairly simple plan. Halloween was approaching, and we wanted to do something actually scary. At this point, I should probably introduce the members of our group of friends who were present that night. Look, I've changed everyone's names, just for the sake of privacy, okay? There was me. I was probably 13 or 14 at the time, big for my age, and thinking I was a lot tougher than I really was. There was James, my best friend and the de facto leader of our little group. He was always the first to try anything and the one who would motivate the rest of the guys if there was any resistance on our part. James also had this knack for always getting out of a tight situation. Even caught red-handed, he could think his way out of a jam faster than any of us. His quick thinking, it had saved us a couple of times from landing in trouble with parents, teachers, and once or twice, the police. Then there was David, a good kid. We used to joke that we'd corrupted a choir boy when he started to hang with us. He could be quiet at times, but also had this ability to put us all in stitches with his off-the-cuff, oftentimes under his breath, jokes. And finally, there was Danny. He was always with us, no matter where we went, even though he spent most of his time being worried or fearing the consequences of whatever it was we were doing. He was a year younger than us, and he showed every bit of it. He ended up being the brunt of a lot of jokes within our circle, for that very reason. Between James and I, we had decided that this Halloween, we'd do something different. We'd hit that age where it felt lame to go out trick-or-treating with the little kids in the neighborhood. After all, we were basically all teenagers. We decided that we'd spend the better part of the night in the sprawling forests surrounding our community. These forests, they were part of a larger state park, spanning well over 800 acres. We'd spent plenty of times in the park during the daytime, but we thought it would be a whole different ballgame at night. We had heard some stories about what went on in the forest after dark, and we were intrigued. We knew that older kids would go into the park at night to drink and smoke away from the prying eyes of their parents. But what really got us amped up was the rumours that the forest was haunted, and that it was fairly easy to experience something while inside the forest at night. We'd heard different things, nothing concrete, and actually nothing all that sinister. The most common story, it was about a man working for the lumber company that used to operate out of the area before it became a state park. He'd been mortally injured by a falling tree, and his peers felt that he wouldn't last the night. No attempt was made to get the crushed man to a hospital, nor was a doctor summoned to the logging camp. The view was that the situation was entirely hopeless. The man was in extreme pain, and though they had managed to extract him from underneath the fallen tree, they left him on the outskirts of camp because they couldn't take the incessant screaming. Those close to him had brought him water and whiskey to ease the pain, but the man had cursed them and sent them away. His screams, they lasted deep into the night, the logger's friends listening as the screams became more and more ragged. It was finally resolved that the man needed to be put out of his misery. The logging foreman had elected to do the deed, but just as he headed out of camp, the screaming abruptly ended. All present assumed that the man had died and was finally at peace. They slept soundly and were relieved to have the terrible ordeal over with. The next day passed without incident, except for the burial of the dead man and a brief ceremony. However, as night fell on the logging camp, the remaining men were horrified to hear the screams again, just as they had the night before. The screaming continued as the men stared wild-eyed into the darkness surrounding their camp. Hours passed, and the screaming, it only continued. The men began to crack. Some openly wept. Others stared silently into the fire. All of them wished for the screams to end. Once again, the foreman rose without word and began walking towards the fresh grave. But before he had left the vicinity of their camp, the screaming once again ceased. However, this time, the woods were not silent. The men could hear, albeit extremely faintly, the sound of a woman's voice singing what sounded like a children's lullaby. The men strained to hear the words, but none of them could make them out. They whispered among themselves that perhaps it was the spirit of the forest coaxing the dead man to rest at last. Much of the logging in the area had dissipated in the years to follow, as more profitable tracts of land were made available in other parts of the state, with better proximity to sawmills and rail lines. But the story has persisted in the area for generations. With stories like this surrounding the park, there were ample reasons for us to want to spend our night inside the forest. Looking back on that night, it seems to check all the boxes on the horror movie cliché checklist. Dumb plan? Check. Halloween night? Check. Stories of a haunted place that have persisted for generations, but no one bothers to give any credence to? Check, check, and check. When I have told this story to people in the past, they range from incredulous to genuinely freaked out. But one comment that I get more than any other is this. The story would be a whole lot more believable if you hadn't started with one Halloween. I am in total agreement. The only problem is, it actually did happen on that night. So, Halloween night rolls around. We headed out under the pretense that we were going to chaperone my little brother and his friends as they collected their candy. We'd also said that once the little kids' night was over, we were going out ourselves, and we'd probably all crash together at one of our houses. We walked with the little guys for a while, until they linked up with a larger group of kids and parents from our neighborhood. Sensing our chance, we ditched out and headed to a side entrance to the park. The entrance was blocked off with barricades, probably to prevent this exact kind of thing from happening, and we actually thought we'd have to find another entrance when we saw a police cruiser parked right next to the wide mouth of the path. The cruiser turned out to be empty, so we hurdled the barricades and plunged into the park. It's incredible just how quickly it can turn pitch black when you're walking beneath the forest canopy. It's an uneasy feeling, just leaving behind the streetlights and the noise of the road for a narrow, quiet path through the woods. We hadn't gone more than a quarter of a mile before Danny started to complain. He was nervous, he was tired, he was anything that would get him from going any further into the woods. We tried to guilt him into staying, but he walked off wordlessly, back toward the road. David followed after him, leaving James and I shaking our heads in disbelief. We had planned this all week, and already the two of them had turned around. We bitched about them to each other and pressed on. We walked further and further into the woods, using a small mag light to see the path in front of us. Houses were no longer visible. In the darkness, it was so thick that it was claustrophobic. James cracked some jokes, but it was obvious that we were both feeling rather uncomfortable. It's hard to articulate, but as we walked on, we were overcome with a feeling of increasing dread. It could have just been the forest, or maybe we really were just a couple of easily scared kids. But something felt entirely off. When I finally glanced at my watch, I saw to my amazement that we had been walking for an hour and a half. It certainly had not felt like that long, but I guess that looking down at the small patch of light illuminating a pitifully small circle of trail, it sort of put us in a bit of an autopilot, and we'd walked on without much chit-chat and without ever realizing how far we'd gone. At this point, James turned to me and asked, "Are we still on the main trail?" I responded that I had no idea and couldn't remember the last time we'd passed a split in the path. James shone his light around and we could see no recognizable features in the area. This was a forest where we'd spent a lot of time. I knew this place like the back of my hand, and I could walk miles through this forest without ever feeling turned around. But at night, it was completely different. Everything looked completely featureless. Nothing stood out in the mass of trees and brush that surrounded the path. We debated turning around, but both of us knew that if we really had been on the main path for over an hour and a half, then we were getting closer to another entrance if we just kept on going. By now, both of us were pretty bloody scared. There was no obvious reason except for the feeling of isolation and disorientation. Nothing obvious had happened at this point, but we were definitely getting jumpy. As we walked on, we thought we heard someone following us down the path. There was a sort of swish, swish noise behind us. But every time we stopped to listen, we were met with only silence. We sped up the pace a bit and were hoping that at any moment we could see the lights of homes surrounding the outskirts of the park. After another 30 minutes of walking, James stopped and shook his head. "This isn't right. We've been walking on the same path for 2 hours and haven't seen any trail markers." I nodded. "We should have gotten to the end of the path by now, and I can't figure it out." He looked really distressed. That freaked me out even more. I tried to be calm, but I doubt I did a very good job. I proposed that we'd gotten off the main trail at some point, and we were now on a smaller, less used path. One that didn't have trail markers as frequently as the park's main arterial trails. This didn't seem to help very much, and then we started to hear more noises coming from the darkness around us. The swishing sound was back, and now it was accompanied by the sound of snapping branches and twigs. James and I didn't pause for a second. We bolted in the direction that we'd been heading. We ran and ran, the light bouncing all over the trail, casting crazy shadows all around us. I'm not sure how long we ran, but we finally caught a glimpse of house lights a good ways in the distance. We couldn't hear any sounds behind us anymore, and quickly reverted back to our normal demeanor. We laughed about the fact that some animal had spooked us so bad that we'd nearly shat ourselves. The relief we felt was undeniable. We could recognize the trail and see houses at the top of a hill ahead. We headed up the hill and turned along one final switchback before having a straight shot up the final rise. The turn caused us to briefly lose sight of the house lights ahead, and we hustled to bring them back into view. At the apex of the bend, I felt something cold and damp, brush against my arm, and then wrap around my wrist. I jerked back, and I saw something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Bone-white fingers were wrapped around my wrist. It took my brain a second or two to process what I was seeing. James noticed that I had stopped and swung the light over to me. I turned to him in complete shock and tried to raise my arm to show him what was happening. His scream snapped me out of my trance, and I jerked away from whatever was holding onto me. James' light, shining in my eyes, had greatly reduced my ability to see anything as I twisted away from this thing in the darkness. The grip on my wrist only tightened as I began to buck and kick like a wild animal. Something had a hold on me, and I wanted out. Every ounce of my energy was channeled into that simple desire that this thing let me go. Despite my best efforts, I could not get these fingers to unclench. Finally, I stopped trying to withdraw, and I attempted to kick whatever the pale, bony arm was attached to. I kicked at it with all my force, screaming, "Let me go!" And suddenly, for whatever reason, the grip released. I stumbled back, panting. James was in hysterics next to me, staring at the ground. I never looked up. I kept my eyes locked on the ground, but I could feel something standing over me. It was this giant presence that felt neither good nor bad, just indifferent, and massive. The presence, whatever it was, made some sort of groaning sound, and then it was gone. I didn't even have to look to know that it was no longer there. It was as if, one moment, there had been a cloud in front of the sun, and then the cloud had gone. I didn't need to see it happen to know that it had been there and wasn't there any longer. We got to our feet, James still struggling to compose himself, and me, too dumbfounded to even have a reaction beyond shock. For a moment, I felt a terror beyond description when I thought, we will turn that corner where we know that there should be houses, and nothing will be there, only darkness. Thankfully, the lights were still there, and we were out of that park and back into the bustle of Halloween in no time. I still hadn't really come to terms with anything that had just gone down. My primary concern was James, who looked badly shaken from the experience. He didn't want a word said about it, and I was not going to push him. I couldn't understand everything that had happened in its entirety, but I definitely knew that it was not good. Days later, James and I finally broached the subject of what he had seen. I'd spent my time since Halloween essentially trying to dismiss and explain away what had happened. Maybe we'd been the victim of a high schooler's prank. Maybe we'd disturbed a homeless person sleeping in the park. Maybe it had just been a branch snagged on my arm, and in our crazy, nervous state, we had panicked and reacted weirdly. Each time I thought of one of these plausible explanations, my mind went straight back to that feeling of not wanting to look up for fear of what I might see, in the sense that I was in the presence of something very large and intimidating. At first, what James described did not seem large or intimidating. From his perspective, we'd been walking around the bend, with him slightly ahead of me. We'd passed a bench along the side of the park, and James thought it was odd that I'd stopped in front of it. When he turned and shone the light towards me, he had seen a figure sitting on the bench next to me, with its spindly hand holding me in place. The figure, James said, was that of an old, stately-looking woman. I thought this description was fairly innocuous, if a little creepy, and James continued on. He had started screaming because he'd noticed that something was off about this woman's features. It wasn't immediately identifiable, but he just knew that it was all wrong. He described it as being kind of an influx of interchangeable without ever changing the overall look of her face. At times, she appeared featureless, like a blank slate, and then things would come back into focus, then out again, as if he could never see her 100% clearly. Then, he described a feeling of sheer terror and helplessness as he sunk into the ground, unable to help me. After he drifted off, I tried to break the silence by saying, "Jeez, do you think I kicked the crap out of some old lady?" James laughed. Talking about it seemed to ease his mind a little. But me? I was more disturbed than ever. I wanted an explanation for the occurrences of that night, but I never got an answer I was satisfied with. I've gone back to that exact spot, during the day of course, and the bench is still there. But that's all. There's nothing about the area that seems particularly off Whatever had happened that night was seemingly confined to that particular place during that particular time. The experience did shake us up quite a bit, and it took quite a while before we ever really sought out trouble again. I guess I can't say for sure what really happened or what the hell that thing was, but I can attest to the fact that the terror that we felt in those woods was inarticulate. Something so foreign happened that parts of my mind literally shut off during the experience. I've never experienced a similar feeling in my life, and honestly, I hope I never do.